I'm a mechanical engineer with an MBA, and I've done a lot of work in startup companies. I've bought companies, sold companies. We don't burn anything, so there's zero emissions, and it is available in a wide swath of the world to be used and exploited for green electricity. But it is only 0.3% of the United States electricity that's generated is from our geothermal power. And the reason is there's limited geologic sites that traditional geothermal can be deployed successfully and economically in. With Derichsweiler's CO2 plume geothermal technology, we expand that footprint dramatically from these orange spots that are on the screen, the traditional geothermal, to about 45% of North America that could be candidates for our CO2 plume geothermal technology, and thus expanding the usage of geothermal beyond its present usage. We're seeing more and more interest in geothermal. I'd like to say we're part of that interest. And I just see people are exploring. There's a plethora of options that are being explored. Some of them aren't going to make it, but some will. And the more things we look at, and I think most of these are using technologies that have been pioneered or precipitated out of the gas and oil industry, because one of the biggest costs for traditional geothermal is drilling those holes. Now with me, somebody pays me to put the fuel in the ground. So I have a little different situation, which I consider a positive, but the traditional geothermal folks that are going to drill at a new site and that's all they do, the drilling cost is really an issue. And in traditional geothermal, the issue has been the success rate of those wells. In our case, they're paying us to put the CO2 in the ground, so that's all taken care of. So I have a lot less of a risk profile in my view.
I ngā mana, I ngā iwi, ka huri ngā mihi kia koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everybody, I am Andy Blair. I'm the president of the International Geothermal Association, co-founder of a company called Upflow, a research consultancy and innovation company based in New Zealand, and a global board member for Women in Geothermal Wing. I'd like to welcome you all today to our panel. Our panel title is Indigenous Voices and Just Transition. So this session is intended to invite some honest perspective from Indigenous and community voices who have a stake in geothermal. Now we know from projects in the past, meaningful engagement with Indigenous communities has proven to be difficult. And our illustrious panel today will provide insights, we'll discuss some challenges, and talk through some of the solutions to help us all do better at connecting with and including Indigenous communities in geothermal projects. At COP26 last year, it was discussed that the climate crisis is not an environmental crisis. The planet will carry on without us. It's a human crisis. We just need somewhere we can live. And we know that those that contribute least to the problem are suffering the most and will continue to do so. So we need to make transformative change. So if it's about people, and we know that geothermal is great for the environment, communities, and economies, then how do we make sure that the people of the land we work on play meaningful roles and benefit from long-term geothermal projects? Now, don't worry, we know this is an interesting topic, so we'll get to your questions at the end of the session and we'll give you plenty of time. But for now, I'd like to invite each of my speakers to introduce themselves. So firstly, Alison.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, bonjour, Thompson. I'm Alison Thompson. I wear many industry hats, including chair of the Canadian Geothermal Energy Association. I'm a CEO and investor in Borealis Geothermal and also Kitselas Geothermal, which is a majority Indigenous-owned company. And I'm also recently a board member of the Métis Settlements Development Corp. So I've been known as a bit of a thought leader in the Canadian geothermal space, and I've had success with influencing the development of federal and provincial policies and programs to try to help this industry get off the ground. We still don't have any operating geothermal power plants yet in our country. So I'm often using my own time and money, and we use our company projects as feedback loops for the government, as when we hit a regulatory barrier or challenge, it can be overcome and made better for follow-on companies or projects. I'm a chemical engineer with a business degree, and I spend most of my time using our companies as a force for good.
Thanks, Alison. Over to you, Aroha.
Pōmaria, ko Aroha Campbell. tukuingoa. I have been a governor for over 30 years, and through that time establishing our trust, and also supporting other lands trusts and incorporations as well. We are, as in Tauhara North Number 2 Trust, proud owners with our joint venture partner with Ngā Tamariki, and we also have interest in, Ngā Purua, and we also have interest in Ngā Tamariki. And so geothermal is it.
Kia ora. And so Aroha is a thought leader and a recognised individual in the geothermal community in New Zealand, and her leadership in leading Māori through this geothermal venture over the last 30 years is really, and she's in high regard back in my home country. So over to you, Salina.
Hey everyone, Salina Derichsweiler. I'm an Inupiaq woman. My family comes from the village of Kayana in Alaska, and I'm also CEO of Transitional Energy. And our focus is really on how can we co-produce geothermal with oil and gas. If we're sitting in oil and gas today and we want to move to geothermal, how can we include communities in that and move forward? Having come out of the oil and gas industry and having worked with tribes, the idea of energy sovereignty and thinking about energy as a core need for all communities. I think inviting everyone to have a part in our future is the really important part of what we need to do. And so geothermal is a both and company.
Great, thanks, Salina. And now last but not least, hola, buenas.
Buenas tardes. I'm Elizabeth Torio Henriquez. I work in La Geo, a geothermal company in El Salvador. I am a geologist for about 20 years now. We have 2 geothermal fields with around 204 megawatts installed capacity and contributes around 25% to the energy mix of the country. I am also involved in activities of direct use in El Salvador and Central America. And at present, I am WING, Women in Geothermal, El Salvador Ambassador.
Great. Gracias. So here we have the panel ready for a discussion. And we hope you enjoy what I see to be will be very passionate discussion about this topic. So let's move into some discussion. I've got some questions. So maybe to kick off with, how do we build relationships and trust with local communities, and why should we? Aroha, would you like to start?
I think it's for a developer, I think it's hugely important that they ensure that local communities or the landowner specifically is there's interaction right at the beginning. And so that's the start of building a relationship. And because those conversations, they will get to understand each other. And also what's important for the organisation, I guess from an Indigenous perspective, is actually looking at the developers in terms of the values, but how do they apply those values, and do we align with those values as well? Participation, because that's what we want. And also understanding how that participation might look like. In my experience in that with developers, it's been open, honest, and upfront. We're not the experts in these fields when it comes to geology and that as a landowner, and so we're relying on consultants to provide us with that clarity. And then sometimes it changes. And so we take what is said to us as gospel. And so for me, it's around do what you say. And if there's changes, is don't sit on it, is come out and talk about it. And so that there is a combined solution that we work forward as opposed to being told.
Great, thanks, Aroha. So I see a key bit in there saying, you know, when us technical people turn up and have discussions, we have to be thoughtful about the words we use, because they are grabbed and held on to as the truth when we know that geothermal projects are dynamic and they move and change. And so making sure that we understand that's what's going on. Is there anyone else that would like to contribute to that question? Yes, Alison.
Just a quick comment, because I agree. And your question was, you know, why should we expect this trust building? And I think simply because projects and people will move at the speed of trust.
Oh, that's a nice catchphrase, Alison. And I like it. Yeah, I agree. Yes, back to you, Aroha.
I think also is that the understanding that from a developer and the people within that organisation need to understand that from a landowner perspective and its owners and shareholders, that we will be there forever. And so therefore the relationships have to be strong, and understanding that people have their bad hair days, but being honest and true around the table, and that's going to make a really successful development, and certainly from our perspective within Tauhara North No. 2 Trust, that has been the case, and now we are, our whānau, our families, are seeing the benefits from that relationship and the output of generation from our geothermal plants, and now we are diversifying into other investment areas, especially in the social side.
Yeah, thanks, Aroha. So just to note, Tauhara North No. 2 Trust sits on top of the Rotokawa geothermal field and has equity in a power station, significant power station, Ngāwapirua. So this trust was maybe 18 years ago, Aroha. You can talk to, you know, the Lands Trust, which a trust is basically a group of a family, had a small amount of money in the bank 18 years ago, something like that, and now has $500 million in assets, and of those geothermal assets are the mainstay for the revenue generation. So a proven pathway to success for Indigenous communities. So moving on, let's go on to what we think are the biggest challenges that locals and communities face, and how can geothermal projects provide solutions to those challenges? Beth, would you like to lead us off?
Okay, now Laheo, you know, now is already in the commercial stage of development. So we are guided by corporate values. So with these values, we created a foundation. It's called Fundaheo, which is based on the social responsibility policy of the company. And Fundaheo executes projects that would benefit the community. So we give credit, a lot of credit to Fundaheo, because they implement programs geared towards health, education, basic infrastructure. But what is the biggest challenge? What are the biggest challenges? There are some of, we can tell, you know, it's mainly focused on the community, how they can improve their standard of living, what meaningful change they can have in their lives. How can they benefit from geothermal projects through employment, through their primary needs, and then, of course, not leaving the participation of women in these activities. I speak for El Salvador and the Central American region, where the biggest challenges are mainly the lack of resources to meet the needs of the people. For example, in the communities, we have deteriorated schools, roads, community houses, the lack of family income for the children to continue studying, lack of orientation for reproductive and sexual education, lack of assistance, psychological assistance, some illiterate group. So how do we provide solutions to this? And here comes Fundaheo. Yeah, Fundaheo comes and takes priority in the needs and giving hope and solutions to the people. The activities of Fundaheo are usually updated, In 2018, Andy came here with a program of Ventana al Mundo, or Window to the World, where they have courses on art, English, and computer. But because of pandemic, the government decided to give computers to the students so they can have online classes. But the problem was they cannot perform the platform, the virtual platform, Google and Classroom. So Fundaheo was there to support them. And for health programs, Fundaheo gave equipment and materials for COVID, safety measures, for prevention of dengue. And for education, now we are giving scholarships to those students who continue at the university and give them a chance to practice to have the practicum in Laheo. So there is a lot of, now that we are in the commercial stage, Fundaheo has given a lot of benefits to the people. Every single projects also need local working force, so they have an extra income. For example, we diversify also for direct use projects. We hire female local people, especially female, for candle manufacturing, so they can have an extra income. So everything that we do, direct use or indirect use, we tell them the importance of this project because it will benefit them really.
Great, thanks,
Yeah.
Beth. And I know that the Beta project in El Salvador is a really shining light for other communities, and geothermal projects happen in those rural isolated projects, and so the communities around them can prosper if it's really thought out, and that's a great example of dragging women, or not dragging, inviting women into the table, because we know that when you lift women up, they take everyone else with them. So Salina, do you want to add to that conversation?
Yeah, I think bringing up some of the highlights that COVID showed all of us, the inequity in terms of what goes on in communities, and communities where maybe have not been included and historically have been systemically harmed by policies, by energy, by the way that things have been developed up to this point. And I think recognizing that history, learning from that history, and trying to build a different future, and that building of a future needs to include those communities, going to the communities and saying, what are your biggest challenges? I think of the Navajo community here, the Navajo Nation, they were without power during the pandemic. So how can they educate their children? Education is a core part of how we build communities. And so even just a basic need, that idea of energy being a basic need, it starts there. And, when the Osage were moved from their river communities over to the prairie communities in Oklahoma, and then in, the Federal Bureau of Investigation systematically murdered for the rights to oil. And that's a part of the history. So there's a mistrust, Aroha was saying that that trust is really critically important in communities, and that trust has been broken in the past. And if your word is everything, that trust needs to continue being built. And that means being inclusive in what those needs of those communities are. So we always think of going to a community and really sitting down to identify the problem. Let's agree on what the problem is that we're solving, and let's talk about what the real needs and challenges are and how we all can provide solutions. And that's solutions on whether you're working inside that community or maybe you're at the regulatory level inside of a government, right? It shouldn't take 2 years to get permits on their own land. And so thinking about how can we solve all these little tiny things that just get in the way, that continue to challenge the inequity in energy. And I think those are all really important factors to consider.
Absolutely. And I think, you all have touched on a point that, relationships are important. And I think, when we think about geothermal projects, they are, long-term, decades projects that are inside communities with people who live there for a long period of time. And, you know, when you're building a relationship with someone, it's really hard when you're from that community and you're building a relationship with a company, because you're there forever, but company people come and go. And so who are you having a relationship with? So how do we navigate relationships between companies and individuals? Because, you know, when you sit down and build trust, you often sit and look someone in the face and you say, this is, I'm going to trust you and you're going to trust me. How do we move forward together? How do we keep, you know, who does this well? How do we keep those relationships and build relationships when they're company and community? Yeah, Aroha.
I think right at the beginning, it is around the relationship is at all levels. So at a governance level, at a senior operations level, and then also at the ground floor. And so from our perspective is also the same. And so it's appreciating what each group do, having those conversations, having a pathway that from a ground level that they can accelerate any concerns or that they can't resolve up the ladder, and so then you have a certainty that a solution will be found if it has to get to the top in terms of board to board, and having annual hui from board to board. We do that, and of course we haven't had that for a couple of years with COVID and that, but we are re-establishing that. And in that time, there's been some changes at a corporate level, and so getting to understand and meet who is the next one that we're having to deal with, but also sitting down with them, understanding, and this is understanding who they are, but also as a person and your family and their family. So then you have a different conversation as well.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Aroha. And I think there's a really cool model that I've heard of called called a braided river model, where when two parties come together, you know, rivers braid in and out, and you find the place where you both meet with the same interests, concerns, and understanding, and you build the trust there so you can move into the spaces you don't understand so well together in a trustful way. So this sort of moves on to, you know, companies and their, you know, values and how they operate. We've talked about values quite a bit, and what does it actually mean? I mean, it's not a poster on a wall. It means, you know, adopting and being authentic. So what social responsibilities do companies have? Alison, maybe I get you to kick off.
Sure, and I think kind of keying off what we're talking about with trust, if you don't yet have a relationship or trust with a company, then I think if you want to be disappointed, then I think having expectations of companies' social responsibilities actually sets you up for that, you know, to be disappointed. Companies are not governments, and they're not all going to act the same way. But however, you know, many in our industry in particular, there are some companies who consistently put their community and their social stakeholders on even footing with themselves, with their investors, with their company. And in particular, at our end, we've taken the step to become a globally certified B Corporation, which is a benefits corporation. You have to change your bylaws and do a bunch of legal things to qualify for that. And we've been doing that since 2017. And then just earlier this year, we were named in the top 5% of companies in our category as being a best for the world, not best in the world, but a best for the world. And so my recommendation to stakeholders looking for companies with social responsibilities is just that: look for a choice before you become disappointed. You know, you can spend a lot of time trying to fix things or correct things, or you can enter something and develop that trust. And again, back to that, move at the speed of trust.
Thanks, Alison. I think it's really important. Like, don't try and convince companies to have, you know, corporate responsibility. Find ones that already do. I mean, that's a really clear message, because it's a long road, and if people aren't willing at the start, you know, it's going to get tough. Does anyone else want to make a few comments? Salina?
Yeah, I think, from a social responsibilities of what companies have, being a CEO of a company, I think it's really important to think about who's leading companies and what the values of those individuals are. And we talk about, the importance of women and the importance of diverse voices. And this is, to me, this is what we mean by it, that these voices, who we center in that conversation, it really does matter how companies will move forward. So what type of leaders are running those companies, and what values do those leaders have? I think going in and thinking about communities, I, without a doubt, fully believe companies have a social responsibility. I mean, economics and making money is not separate from living our lives as human beings. We have 7 years to solve this climate crisis. We're at a time, we're not talking about money anymore. We're talking about solving it. And if there's not a social responsibility, I just think, like, what are we all doing here? Aren't we in a social pact to be, build a home for all of us on this earth? And so thinking about, absolutely, if you're going to be part of society in terms of economics, I think you have absolutely a social responsibility. And that starts, I think, at the top of where those values lie.
And I think that's a really good point. And I think also, being socially responsible is not in conflict with economic prosperity. And the sooner we grasp a hold of that, I think, the better off we're all going to be. So maybe move on and say, Beth, you just spoke about some really cool examples that geothermal companies are having in the community to help lift them up. What are you most proud about?
Well, I'm proud of everything, I'm proud of being in a company that is thinking of the welfare of the people, the community. I'm proud also that we have from the health, thinking of the needs of the people. I'm also proud that women are not forgotten. We hire women to work in maintenance during maintenance of our power plants. I'm also proud that we have big and small projects for the community. Even if it's small, the community really values it. I'm proud that I'm part of WING. I'm part of WING, and I'm part of one of the voices of female friends to the geothermal world. So I think I'm proud of everything, Yeah, I'm
great.
proud of everything.
Yeah, thanks, Beth, and we're pretty proud too of all the work that LaHeo is doing in El Salvador. I just want to move on. Maybe we're getting close to our question and answer session. I think, to increase engagement with Indigenous communities, should we be trying to use carrots or sticks or both? Salina, how would you like to answer that?
Yeah, so I probably would phrase it a little differently. I think carrots and sticks for me makes me feel like I am outside of that community. I am an other, and I'm trying to entice someone, or I'm trying to hit someone, and neither one of those feel right, because it is a community to me. It is figuring out, I'm solving a problem for that community. And so, yes, I'm an outsider from that standpoint, but I really want to solve the problem. And so at Transitional Energy, our real focus is being a system integrator, which really means trying to get everyone on the same page. We try and find that common ground with one another. And that can be very, very challenging. There can be a lot of impacts. We have to use a lot of translation language between, just the way there's certain words, the word developer doesn't mean the same thing across the board. And that was something to learn. So we think about it, how can we help pave the way and make it easier? And how can we involve everyone in that process and not exclude? So things like, people are very excited to come along and help build policy. So the legislators get really excited about what we're doing because it's a both and solution. And so figuring out how to make it easier to solve the problem is really, I think, the incentive that folks need. And they need a place in that future. I think if we want to move from oil and gas to renewable energy or clean energy futures, then all of the folks in oil and gas need to come with us. There's a huge set of knowledge that needs to come with us. And the same exists for ancestral knowledge inside of Indigenous communities. The same thing exists inside of governments where there have been very long-term employees. And how can we start to have those individuals who really make up the system and make up the rules come together and solve the problem together? And so that's really, I think, an important factor for incentivizing all of us to get on the same page and find that common ground with one another.
Thanks, Salina. And we've just got 1 minute to go before we jump into some question and answers. But I think, government is a big question when we talk about engaging Indigenous communities. And Alison, I think you've got a really good point about the role that government should play in Indigenous engagement. If I give you a minute, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure. I think that governments shouldn't tie or put conditions to funding Indigenous projects that they wouldn't put on a non-Indigenous company or hold them to different standards. And so my example would be if a community is receiving government funding and they have an opportunity to sell their energy to a large industrial customer who's going to sign that 50-year energy purchase agreement, then they can use those proceeds to return to the community and use the financial resources as they see fit. Versus sometimes government funding, at least in Canada, you have to do the project in the community. And so the community is small, you're measured in hundreds of people. That's not an economic scale. And so giving money to help develop projects, there should be not these extra conditions or these kind of hindrances that wouldn't make a project a success in the more traditional kind of corporate market.
Yeah, really interesting. An extra burden that comes with government support, and I think we've seen that in New Zealand, Aroha, right, where big trusts have decided to fund themselves and find other mechanisms outside of government funding because of those burdens that are tied to that funding. So now we're just going to move into the question and answers because there's some people are firing in some questions. So get ready, panel. I'm about to lob some questions at you. So even if we have an inclusive collaborative process, there will be disagreements. What mechanisms can be built to avoid escalation of disagreements that become obstacles to projects? So how do we manage conflict in a positive way? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? Yes, Salina.
I'll go back to, I think that conflicts are a normal part of any negotiation or problem solving. It's a very normal thing. So I think normalizing first that that's going to happen, expect that that's going to happen. And I think at least my view and our view at Transitional Energy is it's another problem to solve. And maybe it's a problem we're solving down the road, or maybe it's not part of this project scope. So we continue to try and find, well, where is the last common ground we had and how do we build from there? Because that's how to get through conflict. So as we have found in our company, as we've invited more and more diverse ideas in, it actually increases conflict, which requires us to also then do more relationship building, more team building, more trust building. And so I think accepting conflict as the norm combined with how do we continue to find our common ground and then build together, build that common future. And sometimes you can't agree on everything, right? You're going to have to find an agreement that says we disagree on that piece and find a solution for each party.
Great, thanks. Beth, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah. Actually, when you start a project, for example, in the exploration stage, you need to have the communication first, the dissemination of the project to the local community, so they will know what are the pros and cons of the project. And then when they accept it, I think you need to consider hiring the local people to help you in some of the activities. I think communication first is very important. Yeah, meeting with the community. Yeah. Thanks,
Beth. Yes, Aroha.
I think communication is so right. But I guess from our perspective is sitting around the table and outlining in terms of that here's a project. It's a win-win. It's a win-win for both sides.
Yeah.
And so therefore, when there is an issue that needs to be resolved, is that that from a developer's perspective is come to the table with solutions that has a win-win for both of us, not a win for the developer, but we have to make concessions. And because that's where the conflicts and the arguments start in that. And so that has worked out very well right at the beginning when we were starting to build the relationships and communications in that. And actually that has, without saying it, it's become the norm.
I think it's interesting there, Aroha, and the way you have phrased that. If a geothermal project has a win-win, meaning Indigenous peoples have a real stake in the project, meaning equity, not just feelings, but actual stake. That means when problems happen, people work really hard to solve them because everybody's going to win out of that solution. So I think that's a really good way to think about that. So I'll just move on to the next question from the crowd. At least in North America, the tribe government level of trust does not have a positive history. What must be done differently to build the perfect relationship this time? Relationship's perfect, first of all, but what are the key things that must be done differently standing on that history? Would someone like to address that? Alison, thank you.
Just a really short comment because I want to endorse what Salina said earlier. It shouldn't take 2 years to get a permit to do a project on your own land. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, let's start there for sure. Yeah, I think what we can learn from the history of energy is this idea of there can be sovereignty, and the Indigenous communities have a right to their own resources. We have an abundance of resources in all of our communities. We just need to utilize them in the most effective, beneficial way. And so, thinking about how the communities can be in charge of their own energy and their own lands and their own rights, that's sovereignty. That's what the treaties are meant to stand on. And so it really requires the federal government to honor those treaties that were put in place, to be totally honest. And then I think the other piece of it is knowing that the trust has been broken and that we're in a rebuilding trust atmosphere. And what does that look like and how do we do that? Our word is everything. And so if we are going to show up and, everybody wants to know that what the government says they're going to do is what they're going to do. And if they continue to not do it, there can be no trust. So the biggest learning is honor the treaties, honor what's already there, and try and make some changes. Things like don't let it be 2 years to get a permit approved. Let's all try and help improve that.
Yeah, great comments there, guys. And I think, it's the history is, it's the truth, it's the truth, and don't hide from it. And talking about the hard things are really important as well, because hard things happen in life, and not being scared, because trust means you open up and be able to discuss difficult things to come to good solutions. And yeah, there are some not so great history, but it doesn't mean you can't have a great future if you're open and ready to engage. So I think this is quite relevant to our geothermal community and oil and gas companies that are moving into geothermal. Good question. Are there tensions when major multinationals enter nations with projects as opposed to local entities becoming developers? So someone from offshore, and how should those be addressed? Does everyone get that question? So if someone from outside the country turns up and wants to develop projects, what's some good ways that they can deal with the local community or engage with the local community? Oh, I've stunned everybody.
We don't have that problem in Canada.
Aroha.
Yeah, thank you. I think it goes back to our original question in terms of the relationship. And we're lucky enough that our joint venture partner is a company within New Zealand. But I think that it goes back to the first part in terms of what are they actually bringing to the table? What is the values that they bring? What is the expertise that they bring? What are they actually trying to do? So it's peeling back the layers so that you get a good view from a Indigenous and a landowner perspective. Because a lot of the times that they would more than likely be introduced through a government agency, and that has its own barriers. So I think that, going back to our first point or our first question.
Yeah, thanks, Aroha. And you know, you see a lot of across different industries, you see fly fishing, where someone sits in their own country and goes into other countries from where they're sitting. And then you see other companies that move into that country and be part of the community. And I think, you know, demonstrating meaningful engagement in the community in some real way, you know, building offices, employing locals, you know, spending money on local technical teams, you know, really demonstrates you're actually going to be there. I just want to move on to another question, which is, I think is quite interesting about, so the question is, how does the panel regard novel types of geothermal projects, co-production, closed loops, CO2 working fluids, etc., compared with traditional geothermal that is more well understood? And what I think we have here is, you know, how willing are Indigenous communities to do novel projects that aren't the well understood, you know, a little bit outside the box? Yeah, Alison?
Again, just maybe a very short comment, because as you know, Canada doesn't have any projects, so everything for us seems novel. But I also want to make sure expectations are appropriate. We need to kind of crawl before we can run or fly, at least in our country. And maybe the more bells and whistles we have to add on to it, it just makes it even more difficult at times. So I think we need to be like realistic about making sure that there, like to Aroha's point, there is a win, however small it is, that something, some small project gets going, and then building off of that, then I think the doors are wide open for adding more complexity. But you know, entering into that trust, that relationship, the multi-years of permits, etc. It would be nice to at least be able to ensure that at least some functional, even small project is left behind.
Great, thanks, Alison. And now we're winding up. Now we are near the end of our session, and what I'd like to do is, you know, these women have some great things to do and add to our community, and I'd like to invite you all to leave us all with one message you want to talk to the audience about this space. And I'll invite Beth.
Okay, so what I want to say is companies should be committed to being responsible to society, and by carrying out their operations in an ethical way, you know, and seeking at least to have seeking to have a least negative impact on the community and environment, and maybe contributing positively to social development. So we trust. Your question about trust, we need to build trust, you know. We need to build relationship and trust, and to be close to our communities. How can we do that? By visiting them, listening to the people, evaluating their requests to prioritize the solution which should be best for them. And we need to make them important part of the geothermal project, you know. That's it.
Right.
Muchas
Thank
gracias.
you, Beth. Thank you. Gracias. And then we have, who do we have? Salina.
Yeah. So I think I want to leave everyone with a call to action. You know, I want to remind everyone that it is the people who make up the companies. It is the people who make up the governments. It is the people who make up the rules and the systems. It is all of us. And when we think about, you know, taking what we've learned from history, you know, social history, our governments, history in any kind of science or energy development, I think applying all of those things that we know, that's the abundance of knowledge. That's our wisdom. That's our starting place. And what an amazing starting place we have. We can solve this. We can figure this out. We can take what we know from solar, we can apply it to geothermal. We can take what we know from oil field and apply it to geothermal. And these solutions in the next 10 years are going to be so amazing to see the changes, the real changes in our communities. And so I just want to remind everyone that it is the people that make up these systems. It is each one of us, and each one of us can make a very small change to result in a very big impact.
Great stuff. Thanks, Salina. Aroha.
I think that the respect between the landowner and the developer or operations, but I also think that having a combined respect for the whenua, for the land, and for the resource in it, so that working with the resource in that you are actually feeling more connected in that, and that's huge for our families and our whānau, that the land is being utilised for other things, but also that it always goes back to the resource and how that has been managed and the adaptation across the field, and then that applies in terms of communications out to other lands trusts and that. So,
Okay,
kia ora.
thank you, Aroha. And just Alison, a couple of words from you.
Really quick, everyone can use your company and your projects as a force for good. I think this applies more to direct heat than to electricity, which typically goes on a grid. You may be able to make that energy sale for heat, but some heat customers create more jobs than other heat customers. And that's back to Aroha's, the win-win, or there doesn't have to be a compromise. You can get the same amount of heat sales and a whole bunch of extra jobs. Let's think through these things, as we plan our projects.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We hope you enjoyed our conversation. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. See you later.